Welcome back to the Foundations of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Shaylee Flint. Today, I have a discussion with Irene Daria. She is a developmental psychologist and now a reading tutor. She owns Steps to Reading and also is dropping a new book on August 20th called I Didn't Believe Him. We are going to discuss how she found out that her son actually did not know how to read, what she did to overcome that, and how she got to where she is today, a reading tutor and helping others learn how to read. You do not want to miss out on this episode, and I hope that it can inspire or help any other parent that might be going through the exact same thing. So let's get started. Welcome to the Foundations of Learning podcast. I hope to inspire you to actively participate in your child's learning journey, fostering a love for knowledge and nurturing the skills necessary for success in a rapidly changing world. I have been seeing all over social media, I've seen within my community, that parents are starting to realize that their child cannot read. They'll maybe get to about third or fourth grade, and then this is when they start to see really like where the holes are in their child's reading, and that maybe their child memorized words instead of actually learning how to read. And in comes your book about not believing your child, right? That he didn't know how to read. So kind of take us on that journey of where it started, how you knew he couldn't read, and where you are now.
Okay, so I am a developmental psychologist specializing in teaching kids how to read. The name of my book is I Didn't Believe Him, and the subtitle is My Son Told Me His School Wasn't Teaching Him to Read. I told him to trust his teacher, and this is the story of what happened next. So to answer your question about what happened next to him is what set me on the path to becoming a developmental psychologist specializing in teaching kids how to read. Before that, I was working as a journalist. I had written 3 other books and had gone back to school to study clinical psychology, but because of what happened to him, I switched to developmental psych. I did a lot of research, realized how many children in our country were being labeled learning disabled, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because they had not been taught how to read. And their reading level did not match their IQ level, and therefore they were labeled learning disabled, and it put them on a often not very good academic path, on a path that they really should never have been on to begin with. And I just thought that was such a tragedy. But to let me tell you Eric's story, because I think that's more interesting than my own story, and what I think parents or people in general are tuning in to hear. So Eric's story starts in kindergarten when he began kindergarten, an eager student, ready and excited about learning how to read. He was a very extroverted, chatty little boy, and I thought if anything would happen in kindergarten, he would maybe get in trouble for talking too much to his neighbors, or that he would continue being extroverted and happy and chatty. And that is not what happened. So because of the reading. So the story begins when he comes home and says these words. Now he's 5 years old, remember, 5 years old. Mm-hmm. He comes home and says, "Mommy, my school isn't teaching me how to read. They tell us to look at the pictures and guess what the words are, and that's not reading, Mommy. How do you read?" And I had a few weeks before attended a presentation that his school gave on how it taught reading, and it made no sense to me. So a lesson learned there for parents in general: if your kid's school tells you something that makes no sense to you, ask questions. Don't just accept what the school says and think, oh, it's a really good school, because his school had a fantastic reputation with super high test scores. And you had to apply to get into it. It's a public school in New York, but you had to apply. It was selective admission, and I was just in awe that my child had been accepted to this wonderful school. So they gave us this presentation on reading, and what they said was this: when you read with your child at home, do not have them sound out words. They could sound out words, but why would you want them to when there are so many other effective strategies? So the way the school and millions, now it's important for people to know my book, it's called I Didn't Believe Him. it reads like a novel. Like the early reviews are saying, oh, I couldn't put it down, it sucked me in. It reads like a novel. You're in there with my family as we're experiencing this, and so many families, like you said, will see themselves in our experience, like trying to figure out what's wrong, trying to help our child, trying to figure out how to help our child. And then sort of inevitably, once I started helping my child and went to the school and said, you have to teach differently, the school inevitably said, something's wrong with your child, right? Not something's wrong with our curriculum, but something's wrong with your child. And the narrative drive in the whole book is, who's right? Am I right? Is something wrong with the school? Is the school right? Is something wrong with my child? And I'm trying in the meantime to save his academic life, right? To not have them falsely label him learning disabled. Yeah. But to go back to that meeting, so in that meeting, they did not use these words. I'm using technical terms that they did not use. They just talked about strategies, but what they were telling us without really being very informative, actually, this is what they were doing, and then I'll tell you what they said. Okay. What the school did was it used a method of teaching called balanced literacy, which is the predominant way that most schools in our country teach reading. And what that method does is, instead of teaching kids to sound out words, it tells them to use 3 main cues. It tells them to guess what the words are by looking at the picture, use context clues. Is the story about a horse? So is the picture about a horse? So could that word be horse? This method would also accept the word pony, by the way. As long as the meaning was similar, it doesn't have to be the actual word on the page. Or use the first letter of a word to guess what the word can be. And the theory behind this, how this method came to be in schools, it used to be believed, and research has completely disproven this, by the way, but the people who believe in this theory believed that learning to read is as natural as learning how to speak. When we were babies and we learned how to talk, no one gave us worksheets or told us, this is a sound. They just talked to us and we learned to talk.
You just did it.
You just did it. And that's the theory behind balanced literacy, which is based on something called whole language, which is too much to go into in our podcast today, but this is all explained in the book, the whole history of reading instruction and how it went so wacko in our country. So the theory is that learning to read is as natural as learning how to speak. And if you just read to a child and surround them with books, they will be able, with just a little sprinkling of phonics lessons here and there as needed. It wasn't systematic and working through each rule in order. It was like, oh, this word cane has a silent E at the end of it, and the A makes its alphabet sound. That's how it was explained to kids. And parents would go to the school and say, my child doesn't know how to read words with long vowels, and the response that they would get was, well, your child was absent that day. No one can learn a phonics rule in one day. But it was believed that children could figure this out. And the way this theory came to be was a professor his name was Kenneth Goodman, did what he believed was a study. This is really not a valid study, because a study, to be accepted as a scientifically rigorous study, it's a study that has a control group, it's a study that can be repeated by other people, and you find the same findings. So he sat down and he watched how a bunch of kids read, right? Now, these kids, this was in the 1970s, could have been late 1960s, when in our country, reading was already taught in this wacky way. It's been in our schools since the 1920s with the Dick and Jane curriculum, and kids in that curriculum weren't even told that the alphabet existed.
Which I have to ask you this too, because I am a weirdo, and so I don't even remember, actually. No, the reason I got down this rabbit hole was because, as you did, right? You were like, how are we teaching kids to read? How did we get here? And I started going down these rabbit holes of the history of teaching kids to read, and why did we go to whole language, and why do we use balanced literacy? And now all of a sudden there's this shift to the science of reading. And I actually started reading Horus Man. So he's deemed the father of our education system, right? And he actually had a common school journal, and this was something that was being sent to educators, because at the time when Horus Man was writing this journal, we actually didn't have public schools like we know it today. We had some schools throughout the nation that were considered like public schools, but for the most part, if you were going to learn how to read or do basic arithmetic and write, you learned it in the home. And there was a book, I can't remember what it's called right now, but it was basically teaching phonics to kids. And
McGuffey readers?
maybe, and it was like literally number 2 in the like most sold book in the US. So Bible was number 1, and this was like number 2. And it taught kids how to read via phonics, and families were the ones that were actually teaching their kids how to read. Unless the parents were illiterate and they did not know how to read, then they would maybe hire a tutor or just somebody in their community that they might have known that could teach their child to read and write, and that's what they would do. And so it's funny that in the 1920s, this is also when we as a nation decided that we were going to make a law stating that you had to send your child to these public schools, or you had to send them to a private school, or you had to show some sort of like, I'm homeschooling, whatever, right? So this is kind of when that, what people call like forced schooling happened. And in Horus Man's Common School Journal, which like the people that funded the, not funded, but were a big push in the 1920s to get public schools into, I guess, the forced schooling realm of things, were like Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, these people that were big businessmen, and they loved Horus Man and his ideas. And Horus Man is actually one of the first people, at least from what I can find in literature, is one of the first people that is talking about what you're talking about right now, which is that it's natural, that you can just learn to read by being exposed to books. And he also found phonics instruction very annoying, because he said in his little journal that he was writing that it didn't sound natural because these kids were slow in the beginning. They had to sound out sounds, and they just didn't sound like fluent readers. And so in his head, it was like, no, we don't need to teach them phonics. What we need to do is just show them what a fluent reader sounds like, and they will become a fluent reader, because we're wasting time and years having them go through this process of like segmenting sounds, which I thought was so crazy, because like this journal, I think, was late 1800s is when he wrote it.
Right.
And like you said, in the 1920s, all of a sudden we get into this realm of whole language learning and balanced literacy. And now we're kind of going back to what it was before all of this happened, to science of reading. Anyways, so I just thought it was interesting that you were talking about how it happened in the 1920s. And I'm like, honestly, people don't give Horus Man enough credit for the influences that he did have in what our public schools look like today. Because if you go back and read his journal and you look at how our schools are structured even today, it's honestly wild.
He had even more of an influence than like he actually established the first school of teacher education. So yes. just to say a little bit more about Horus Man and the tragedy behind all of this. No one set out not to teach children how to read, right?
Yeah,
Everyone, like, people believed it was the right thing. And Horus Man actually gave up a position in the government to become the Secretary of Education. He took a major pay cut. He spent his honeymoon with his wife, of course, she came along, touring schools in Europe to see how they teach. Mm-hmm. And this is where he observed this natural way of teaching and brought it back with him to the States. But he was such a believer that he established these schools of education. And what people need to realize, and teachers are now realizing, is that our schools of education have been teaching teachers all wrong. So people say to me, when they read I Didn't Believe Him, they say, oh, aren't you angry at Eric's teachers? And no, I'm not, because teachers were as much a victim of this as the children were. Teachers went to their colleges and they were taught by people that they respected. Columbia University, an Ivy League institution, was behind this, one of the major balanced literacy curriculums called Units of Study. This woman, Lucy Calkins, is a professor at Columbia, and she had a division called the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, which Columbia shut down last year. and now Columbia is saying, oh, they're going to follow the research and they're hiring people who follow the research. In 2024, the research on how children need to be taught reading was definitively settled in the year 2000. Congress had put together a panel called the National Reading Panel, and they had a group of researchers research what is effective for teaching kids to read. And they found 5 things are effective. Phonemic awareness, which is hearing the sounds in spoken words, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, which means stopping at periods and reading as if it's natural, and comprehension means you have to know about the topic that you're reading about to fully understand it. Like I taught a girl who had never been exposed to stories about cowboys, and she didn't understand the story at all because lasso, she couldn't comprehend a lot of the story. But this research was definitively settled in the year 2000. Reading journals will no longer accept any study on what's the best method to teach reading because it's known. It's like, does penicillin kill bacteria? It's like known, it's accepted. And only now is this beginning to filter into schools, and teachers are starting these Facebook groups with names like The Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, and are funding out of their own pockets trips to conferences, doing all sorts of reading about the subject. But this is really just shocking. Like one reviewer for I Didn't Believe Him said, she found the book, there were 4 words, but 2 of them were horrifying and inspiring, shocking and something else. But it's just horrifying what has happened to children, the trajectories of lives ruined, and the pain that the children, kids, when they're not being taught to read and they want to learn how to read, that's very painful for them. They're very... So, but going back, you had asked me about Eric's story. Sorry.
Yes,
so let me.
sorry.
So
you kind of got sidetracked.
So Eric's story is a window to what has happened to millions of other children, and I think part of the reason I wrote this book is I feel like we so narrowly missed a train wreck because I trusted his school. And I didn't follow up when my son said he wasn't learning how to read, when I didn't understand what his school was doing. And I think I forgave myself somewhat when I wrote one of the earlier scenes in the book. It was actually the last scene that I wrote for the book, which is, in kindergarten, the reason I didn't know what was happening, so kindergarten was a nightmare for him. He became... anxious. He would have nightmares that he was drowning. He was drowning because he went to school every day and had no idea how to read what was going on. The other parents, the vast majority of them, had taught their kids how to read at home. I didn't realize that when he was in kindergarten. I'd say about maybe a little less than 2/3 of the class were reading well enough, and another third was in Eric's same boat, that where they didn't know, what was going on. But he was bringing home great grades in reading. But in kindergarten, he brought home a little book called After School, right? And he was supposed to read these little books for homework. They're little pattern books. And parents, if you see these books coming home from school, beware.
By the way, they still sell them at the dollar store, at Target. I was just
at Barnes and Noble.
Yes, I was just at Target the other day, and in the little back to school section and their dollar section or whatever. They have books that are still following. They look like it has the levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, whatever. Level 1 is the lowest level, and it's exactly the pattern books, right? It has the picture because it says this cat can, and then it would be read, or this cat can skate. Well, first of all, they have to know all of these patterns. They have to know silent E, they have to know vowel teams, they have to know and then there was multisyllabic words in there, and it was just repeated words until that last word, and then it had the picture so that it's literally cueing them to use the picture to figure out what this word says. And so they still sell them, and I know schools still use them, unfortunately, but Yes, sorry, go on. I just had to say they still sell those, so don't fall for those if you see them.
Yeah, no, Sally, it's such a pleasure to talk with you because you know so much about this. It's just a pleasure to have this conversation. So he brought home a book called After School, and it was exactly like you said, After School and then you have to guess from the picture what's going on. Now, I didn't realize this. I thought my kid was reading these big, big words, right?
Yeah.
After school, I play with my brother. After school, I go to the park. And then he got to, after school, I have a snack. So the word that's being cued by the picture is snack, okay? Mm-hmm. But the picture is of a little girl sitting on a couch, holding a glass of milk in one hand and a plate with a sandwich on it in her lap. Mm-hmm. So Eric reads, after school, I have a glass of milk. Now, there's only one word on the page, right? Snack.
Hey.
And I said, no, that's not. Right. I said, no, that's not the word. Sound it out. He has no idea what I'm talking about when I say sound it out. And I try to show him, no idea. And then he tries again. After school, I have a sandwich because there's a sandwich in the picture, right?
Yep.
And I say, no, that's not the word. Look at the word. And I try to show him how to sound out the word. No idea. So then I tell him the word is snack. After school, I have a snack. And he says very wisely, how the heck am I supposed to know that, right? How is he supposed to know that word?
Yeah. Fair.
But again, kindergarten year passed, and I have to stress, great report card. Parents, do not trust your children's report card. There was a study done, not really a study, a survey done in Nashville recently where they talked to parents. They surveyed parents in Nashville, and they asked them, did they believe their children were reading at grade level? 78% of the parents said yes, they believed their children were reading at grade level because the report cards were coming home, right? And they were good. Meanwhile, the data showed that only 28.5% of students in Nashville are reading at grade level, and only 19.6% of Black students are. That's a big disconnect, and that happens in math as well, not just in reading, right? Report cards are like, did they come to school? Did they do their homework? Now, I own a K through 12 tutoring company, so I see what happens. Kids are assigned homework, and they get a check if they did it. So often the teacher doesn't even check the homework, so the teacher doesn't know, does the kid know what he's doing?
I will tell you, because as a teacher, right, we did homework. And honestly, in the beginning of my teaching career, I didn't really believe in homework just because in the elementary age, there's not a bunch of research that actually shows that homework is going to help them get better at the skills by doing it at home. It's more of just getting parents involved in academics, but it's not really going to improve their ability per se. And so I didn't really believe in homework, but when I moved to another district, they were heavy on homework. They have to do this amount of reading, they have to do this amount of math, they have to do this amount of writing. They were very strict about it, and you had to do it. There was no choice, actually. And I was that teacher that I was supposed to keep kids in from prep if they didn't do their homework, and I'm teaching first grade. So in my head, I'm it's not a first grader's fault, one, if they don't get their homework done, because they're not at an age yet where they're going to be, one, responsible enough to even go home and do their homework, and two, to maybe even be able to, I guess, successfully get it done in a manner, you know what I'm saying? They're 6 years old, they need a lot of guidance. And so if they're not getting it done, it's not really their fault. It's kind of the parents' fault if they're not doing it. And I never abided by that rule. I was that's a rule I'm just not going to follow. I did that a lot as a teacher. I was I don't think that's right. I'm not going to do that. But as a teacher, when I would look at their homework, I did not ever correct it. I didn't. I just literally would pull it off, and I'm congrats, you did your homework. And at the very end of the day, I didn't show the kids that I threw it in the trash, but at the very end of the day, I would throw it in the recycling bin, because I was there's really, for me, their homework is not going to tell me what I need to know, because I don't know if parents just essentially did it for them. I don't know if the child did it on their own. I don't know how much help was actually given. And so for me, it was this stupid thing that I had to do, and that the kids had to do, and that the parents had to do. And it didn't give me good information as a teacher on what they could actually do. So I didn't find it important and I just threw it into the trash. And then I felt really bad because I'm making these families spend all this time on homework. So I do think that homework is kind of a waste, honestly. Like
you still think that? You still believe that?
For the elementary age, I do. I would prefer, like, if I am going to have parents be involved academically, like, I would prefer to send home a decodable text that's going to be at that child's level and have them just read it with their parents, and then maybe do like a couple of math problems that are review. So like, it's not even going to be like maybe what we're learning at that second in time, it's going to be review, because in math it does show that if you do that spiral review and you constantly have them working on it, it's going to help them improve. And so like, if I was to be able to choose my homework that I sent home, because that was another thing, I couldn't choose it. It was like something that you had to like, I mean, you could choose it, but you couldn't. It was anyways. And so that's what I would do personally if I had the choice, just because it's still working on that skill, but they're like spending more time with their parents, not like doing this massive packet and spending 30 minutes for a first grader to do their homework.
No. Yeah. I
so
think in first grade, decodable readers are the way to go for homework.
Yes, exactly. And so but we had to give them like phonics sheets. We had to give them, which was great because obviously like we were following the science of reading at this point in time. But so we would give them like phonics sheets and then like spelling sheets, and then we'd give them decodable readers that they did have to read. So we were giving them those, and then like a whole math sheet that they had to complete, and then another book they had to read. Like, it was outrageous how much homework they had to do. And if the parents actually did it, yes, it could probably help them just because of the way we were doing homework. But however, I still am just in that mindset of parents don't get enough time with their kids anyway. When we look at like how much time is spent at school and how much time is spent with parents, I personally think that it's more important that parents are just like discussing with them, like, what did you do at school? What did you learn today? Like, just engaging in conversation with them and spending time as a family. So that's kind of like my thought process in it, just because they are away from home for so long, that I just feel like it causes more stress and heartache for some families than it does like a peaceful, like, we're home, we're spending time together, we're eating dinner, we're having conversation. And so that's just my own kind of personal opinion on that as well.
I'm going to weigh in on the stress and heartache, because I write about the stress and heartache that we experience because of me having to teach Eric to read in the book. But I just want to, you're making a very important point. The kids that I see, the teachers not checking their homework, I'm talking about 5th and 6th graders, where that homework should be checked.
Yeah.
So and it often is not. I think that's just something for parents of older children to be aware of.
Yes, and I would agree. And I really do think, and because if I'm being honest, like, we have, as educators, you do have so many assessments that you are, well, okay, let me take this back a little bit here. If you are a good educator that understands what type of assessments to give your students, when to give those assessments, and how to effectively look at that data and understand what to do next, then homework to some educators is like I said, kind of wasted time, because we already have all of these assessments that we're doing all of the time. And whether that be a formal assessment or informal assessment, sometimes you can literally just watch a child do something and you're like, okay, I know where your holes are at. And you don't really have to give them like this formal test to know that. And so I think sometimes too, teachers aren't checking their homework because they have so much data already on them.
Oh, no.
Not in this case. No, that's what I'm saying. Not always. I'm not saying
I was going to say, you were a good teacher at a good school, a truly good school. And yes, oh my God, yes, if your child is being assessed and you know it and you're getting those results,
yes,
just send your teacher flowers, because so often the way Eric was assessed and the way many children in this balanced literacy curriculum are assessed is they need to read one pattern book that determines if they can move to the next level.
Yep.
One book that has really hard words in it that they need to guess from the picture. So, and that's why he was not making progress in school. I get these questions all the time from parents now that I, really know what I'm doing and did my dissertation on how kids learn to read and do this professionally. I hear it all the time, daily. Why is my child making so much progress with you and not making any progress in school? Because when children are taught systematically, step by step, and the books, the decodable readers that you mentioned, those are, for parents that don't know, those are stories that can be sounded out and that have in them the phonics rules that the children have learned, then children can do it because they've learned the phonics rules. They're getting the practice with decodable readers. There's review, and you go back, and then each step builds on what came before. Yes. And the assessments follow that track too. The child has learned this. Can the child do this? The child has learned this. Can the child do that? Assessments are a wonderful thing.
Oh, yes.
But the reason kids don't make progress in school is for that reason. There are no assessments that assess has the child learned these systematic phonics rules, because the children are not being taught these systematic phonics rules, right? It's all hodgepodge and a mess. And that's why you will often, parents, this is the trajectory that happens, and this is what I write about, and I didn't believe him. It was terrifying to me. He's making great progress at home, and I, like you said, I want to be his mom. I want to go buy donuts with him. I want to play in the park. I don't want to be teaching him how to read every day. And not only teaching him how to read, those parents that you sent home homework, they were lucky. You sent home the homework. I didn't know how kids learn to read. I had to figure it out at that time. I was, quote unquote, just a mom, researching online and what phonics rule do I teach them next? How do I teach it? And it took endless hours of work and fear, because when I went to the school and I said, my child is making progress at home, you need to help me teach him, they all of a sudden looked at him and paid attention, and saw that he was not reading, and they began saying, like I said before, something's wrong with your child. And I knew nothing was wrong with my child, and I'm not going to give away the plot point, but we let them evaluate him so that we could prove that there was nothing wrong with him. And I'm not going to tell you what happened, because it's like an unbelievable moment in the book that I think most families would be shocked to read about. But the only hint I'm going to give is, if your child's school ever labels your child or says your child is learning disabled or dyslexic, there was a great article in the LA Times, and I quote this in my epigraph to the book. Faced with a diagnosis of dyslexia, or more generally a learning disability, too many parents fail to ask the school an important question. Well, what exactly did you teach my child? Don't just accept that something's wrong with your child. I'm getting texts and emails from teachers and from a school psychologist, which is just making my heart soar with joy. Because when I wrote this book, I wrote it so that no family would have to go through what we went through. And I am stunned at the positive, and I thought teachers would hate the book. I am stunned at the positive reaction I am getting from teachers and school psychologists, just stunned. And one text from a teacher said, your book is so honest and well-informed, and it is making me question the IEP of every child in my school that has been labeled learning disabled. Because to be labeled learning disabled, in many states, the only criteria is the reading level doesn't match the IQ, right? Well, why doesn't that reading level match the IQ? If the child hasn't been taught how to read, it's not necessarily that the child is dyslexic or has some other issue. It's because the child hasn't been taught how to read. So find a tutor, get yourself a tutor, or I think, Shally, I mentioned to you, I wrote this series of books called Steps to Reading that parents can use to teach their kids how to read at home really easily. And there's a video on my website, Steps to Reading, that parents can look at. Really shows you this is how you teach a child to read. It's easy, it's fun. It can be fun if you are not under pressure. I can't tell you how many times I was sort of really bored out of my mind, rolling little trucks around on the floor, playing with my kids. How wonderful if when he was younger, before he had gone to school, and I was like you, I believed in play too. I was studying to be a developmental psychologist. Children should be playing. And
Yeah.
Eric's preschool teacher wanted to work with him on reading. I actually told her no. Oh, stupid. I said, he should be playing. I didn't realize that the rest of the world, or many families, were teaching their kids at home. And if and when I have grandchildren, you can bet I'm going to teach them how to read. And teachers are teaching kids how to read. Oh, the other school psychologist that I mentioned, she emailed me and said a similar thing, which is horrified her to think about how many kids she had evaluated. And part of that evaluation for issues is the child able to decode, able to sound out. Mm-hmm. And she said, it never dawned on me to think, well, have they been taught how to do it? If they couldn't do it and they were at a certain grade, mm-hmm. The psychologist assumes something's wrong with the child.
Well, and
not
what's
necessarily.
sad too is that, so if you actually look, because here's the thing, like I graduated college in 2019, okay, and I was taught a balanced literacy approach. So my first couple of years of teaching, that is what I was using, and I could see it wasn't working. And so that's probably why teachers are actually like, oh my gosh, yes, like thank you for saying something, because you are like, especially as a new teacher, you're kind of stuck in this, weird dichotomy of the seasoned teachers or the veteran teachers are literally doing the same thing that you're doing. And it's like, well, that's just what I've done and it works great. And when you look at the data, you're like, it's not working great. Like, what are you talking about? But that's probably why teachers are really loving the book, is because they can finally, like, it's like a breath of fresh air when you finally realize how to teach a child to read, because it's so simple. And something else that people don't realize too is dyslexia is not, like, it's not taught to gen ed teachers. Like it's not taught to you in a explicit way, or like in an in-depth way, I guess you could say. You don't learn much about what even dyslexia is and what to look for in a child that has dyslexia. And I actually didn't even learn in depth about what dyslexia was until I did my letters training, which is in the body of research, the science of reading and talking about structured literacy and stuff like that. And I didn't even realize that, like, oh, this is actually, like, kids with dyslexia actually have a phonological processing disorder. And so guess what is the most important thing for dyslexic kids? Phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. Like, those are the foundations of what they need. And these kids might need up to like 200 repetitions before it becomes solid for them. And so a lot of parents would ask me, because, their child is like reversing their B's and D's and, whatever. And I was like, that is, at the beginning, I was like, I don't know, is that dyslexia? Like, I was not even aware, because as a gen ed teacher, you just don't get taught those things. And then if you have a kid, like you said, that they're not jumping levels like they should, then you're like, okay, I'm going to take them to this IEP meeting to see if I can get them qualified, because they're obviously not making progress, but we're not teaching them to read. And so it's not that they can't do it and that maybe they have dyslexia or whatever it is. No, it's just that they weren't taught how to read in a systematic and actual brain-friendly way. They were taught to memorize. They were taught to guess. And so if you're not a very good memorizer and you're not a very good guesser, you're not going to move up in these levels. And so I think it is important to note too, like I said, like, dyslexia is such a complex neurological disorder that is not, you can see this even in their oral language. So it can affect oral language. It's their phonological processing. Like, there are so many different aspects to it, because dyslexic kids are actually really good at comprehension. So like, you can read them a story out loud and they can comprehend it, but it's once they see the symbols on the page. And like you said, like, they're the kids that are going to struggle to segment and blend. They're the kids that are going to struggle a little bit more in remembering these patterns and what these patterns say. But if you are teaching the science of reading and you're doing it in this explicit and structured way and systematically teaching it, you get to see so easily which kids actually do have dyslexia or some sort of learning disability, where in the beginning, like, I had no freaking clue. Like, some of these kids did not have any sort of disability, learning disability. They didn't have dyslexia, but I was like, well, something's wrong because they're not learning to read. But it was just because they weren't being taught. So it is important that you do know, like, what strategies your school is using to teach the kids to read, and ask for data. That's honestly what I would do. If I was a parent and I was seeing that my kid was maybe like struggling to read, or they weren't I don't know, succeeding like I thought they would be at that age, I would ask the teacher, can I see the data on my child? Do you have that data? And, and look at it and talk to the teacher about it. Because if they're simply doing it based on levels and they're not saying words like, oh, well, your child is struggling in phonemic awareness, which is super important, or your child is struggling with short vowels, or your child is struggling with vowel teams, or whatever it is, they should know that exact answer. So I would say too to parents, like, ask for the data and have them explain it to you. And if it's not phonetic rules, then they probably are using a balanced literacy approach. Mm-hmm. But going back to this journey, so your son has ended kindergarten. You are starting to see this pattern, I guess, arise. And so what happens in first grade? Like, did you change anything? What happened there?
Okay, so kindergarten was a nightmare. The summer after kindergarten came, I realized he can't read a word. I got some basic books from the library. Decodable readers were not in the library at that time at all, in my local library anyway. Some libraries now have them, some don't. So some are doing a great job. Georgetown Library is doing a great job in Washington. But I reached out to parents at the school, and that's when I realized that a lot of parents had taught their kids to read themselves, and I ordered some phonics workbooks online. This was before the days of Amazon Prime, and they took forever to come, and by the time they came, I was just so happy. Like you said, enjoying summer. School was out. I was going to the beach with my kids. We were just, I was working at the time at In Style magazine that summer, and in my office on my lunch hour, Googling how to teach a child to read. Anyway, first grade comes. I know he can't read, right? I ask other parents, more parents, what's going on. More and more I learned that other parents had taught their kids to read at home. And I still don't know what's going on with Eric, right? I still don't fully understand. I don't understand how they're teaching reading. I don't understand why he says he now at this point, by the way, has announced in kindergarten that he hates reading, just absolutely hates reading. And when he read those little books that he brought home, his little body would be stiff as cement, and he just looked so unhappy, and I couldn't understand why. Still loved being read to, but hated reading. Okay, so towards the beginning of first grade, my kid, and again, this is what I mean by we narrowly escaped a train wreck, because if my son had not been so determined to learn how to read and determined to get me to understand what went wrong, he would have been on a completely different academic trajectory. I would have believed the school that something was wrong with him. I would have let them assess him. In their assessment, they would have found an issue because of the reading levels. I would have let them give him extra services. Their extra services, by the way, taught in the same way that the classroom did, so those services would have been useless. I wouldn't have known that. I would have thought, my poor child is having such a hard time, my poor kid, Disaster. It would have been a disaster. Eric, by the way, went on to become a stellar student and was salutatorian of his high school, and now has this amazing career that never would have been, because he did this. He came home in first grade and with this really angry look on his face, which was not a typical emotion for him. He was a pretty, except for being unhappy with school and anxious, he was like, angry. Mommy, do you want to see how I read? And I said, okay. And he goes, I'll show you how I read. So I dropped everything, because this was clearly important to him, and like he was, a major message. He took a book. I'm going to take a book, I don't know if you can, and he held it behind his back. It was one of those, I was going to say stupid, but I guess I will. It was one of those stupid pattern books, because they're just so stupid. If they were used correctly, I mean, if you were teaching one word in it, like the, and just pointed at that word, okay. Like, any book can be used in a productive way, but the way they're using them is terrible. Yes. Okay, he held a pattern book behind his back, and he quote unquote read it at exactly the right time. So he quote read, a house is a home. Turn the page. I don't know if you can hear the page turning. A teepee is a home. So the words repeated on the page are is a home. And from the picture, the kids are guessing what the word is, he's memorized it, right? So he knows the whole book. He doesn't need to look at the picture. So a house is a home. Turn the page, behind his back. A teepee is a home. Turn the page, behind his back. An apartment building is a home. Turn the page, behind his back. I almost died. I realized this kid had memorized every single little story that the school sent home last year. He was totally from memory. There's a movie called The Right to Read, which has a wonderful scene in it where a child is reading one of these pattern books and the teacher says to her, "Oh, look at you. You can read those words without even looking at the book," because the kid's looking at the ceiling and quote unquote reading it.
Yep.
So that's when I realized, wow, we have a big problem here.
Yeah.
And I went to the school and I asked for help, and I was told that the reason my child is not reading with me is because he doesn't want to read with me, and that I should trust the school, and if there's a problem, they will figure it out and they will help him, but that I should just trust the process. Parents, do not blindly trust this process. If you have a teacher like Shali was, who is teaching correctly, who is assessing your children, you see your child make progress, your child is reading, trust that school. Trust that school, send flowers, send chocolates, do whatever you can to support the teacher in the classroom. You are so lucky. But so many other families trust the school and realize in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade sometimes that their child cannot read.
It's always later, because that's when they get into texts where these 3 cueing strategies don't work anymore. They can't look at the picture to figure it out. They can't really use, the context clues, because they can't even read the words on the page, and they can't, trying to, like, if I was to give you a word and I covered up the entire word except for the very first letter and I said, guess what this word says, and there was no picture, you're going to have no idea. I mean, there's millions of words that are going to start with the letter R, right? So like, you have no idea. And that's why it's like, I would notice that, because I will say, like, yes, the school I went to was amazing in the fact that that was when the science of reading, like, that's when we really started to implement it. But beforehand, like, that wasn't the case. So like, we had 4th and 5th grade teachers coming down to 1st grade, and they were like, okay, so now that we understand how the heck kids are supposed to learn how to read, and we kind of know what to look for and what they know or don't know, they literally don't know anything. Like, they have no clue what these phonetic patterns are. They don't have phonological awareness. Like, how do we do this? And they were asking us because they didn't have to go through these trainings that we had to. In my state, the state of Utah, which I am, honestly, some of the things they make you do as an educator in professional development are like the biggest waste of time on the planet. But this one in particular was life-changing, not only for me as an educator, but for all of my students from thereafter. And it was that we had to do this letters training, but it was only required K through 3. And so 4th, 5th, 6th, they did not have to take this training. It was like, they should be reading by that point. But what they forget to think about is the fact that these 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders were not actually being taught how to read. And so all of these 4th grade teachers are like, I don't know what to do, but like, they've been learning a little bit from just us 1st grade teachers, right? As we're talking about it in the break room, and we're like, oh my gosh, like, this is so amazing. Our kids are making so much progress, and like, we know what to look for and how to actually teach these kids to read. Like, it honestly was like coming up for water after drowning for so many years. And anyway, so these 4th grade teachers, 5th grade teachers were listening to what we were saying, and then they started asking us for assessments. Like, what type of assessments are you guys giving your students? And they finally realized, like, these 4th graders, these 5th graders are reading at like a 1st grade level, because they did not have the explicit and structured and systematic instruction that they needed to learn. And so these 4th grade teachers are asking 1st grade and 2nd grade teachers for resources. Like, we're giving 4th and 5th graders the same resources that these first graders and second graders are getting, because that's what they need. And so their whole class instruction completely shifted in the way that they were teaching. Their small group instruction completely shifted. And all of a sudden, these teachers that are fourth, fifth, sixth grade teachers that are supposed to be working more on like vocabulary and comprehension and like, you know, really diving deep into texts and writing like essays, are now going back to first grade. And it's honestly insane that, I guess, in saying this, that when you are, like you said, don't trust your school and understand how that they are actually teaching your child to read. One thing too, like you said earlier, is report cards. The report cards, at least in my experience in Utah, because we have the Common Core, which is honestly, it's everywhere. Utah renamed it to try to make parents happy, so they called it the Utah Common Core, and they were saying it's different than the Common Core. It's literally just the Common Core. And what our report cards were, where we had to just say, like, they were meeting this standard, they were meeting this standard, and they were meeting this standard, yes or no. And that's kind of how it went. And so my teammates and I, once we learned about the science of reading, we changed our report card so that it actually met with what it was we were teaching. So, you know, they had to, we also did a Dibbles test. I don't know if they do that in New York or not. If you ever heard of...
I know Dibbles, but no, I haven't seen a school use it.
Yeah, so in Utah, you have to give it. And so we would use that to kind of more gauge on reading fluency. And then we would use the phonics just to see like which phonics patterns they actually knew, and then spelling. And so every parent-teacher conference, we would go over, these are the phonetic rules that your child needs to know by the end of first grade. They have to be able to read words with them, and they have to be able to spell with them. And so we had a list of like 30 words that followed all of those patterns that they had to read within a certain amount of time, because we wanted automaticity in that as well. And then they had to spell with it. And so we would just give them a word, and they would have to be able to spell using that pattern. And we never told them what the words were. Our spelling tests were never given beforehand. Like back in the couple of years before, I would give them a list of 10 words, say, memorize this list, and they would memorize how to spell 10 words. Had no really rhyme or reason. It was just like, here's your 10 words for the curriculum of what it says you have to know, so you have to memorize these. Once we started using the science of reading, it was, you are spelling with the pattern, I don't know, let's say AR. And we never gave them words. We just gave them phonics sheets that had them reading with AR and had them spelling words with AR. And then at the end of the week, we would give them a test where they had to read AR words, and then they had to spell with AR words, but they had no idea what they were going to be. They just had to remember the pattern and be able to segment the sounds and write the letters that match those sounds.
Parents, this is what you should be seeing coming home from your school. That's just fantastic.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Like, as a parent, you kind of can gauge what your child's learning at school based on either the data that they're sending home, because I always sent home the tests and everything every week so that the parents could see, this is how your child's doing on this skill, and so that they could see that. And then obviously, like I said, our homework adapted to meet what the science of reading was. It wasn't like that before, but and so you can kind of gauge as a parent like what it is that they're doing. And if they are doing that and you're seeing like, oh, they're having them segment and blend, or they're talking about these patterns like AR says R or EA says E, like that, and like having them read and spell with those patterns, you can pretty much guess that's they're teaching it in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think that's important to know. So like, don't trust like 100% your school, because they may not be doing it correctly, and always ask questions. And even if you have a grumpy teacher or a grumpy administrator that's annoyed by your questions, don't quit pushing, because yes, I worked at an amazing school, but it also had its problems. And advocating for your child, the teacher can advocate as much as they freaking want. Like, you could sit there and beg and cry for the help that this child needs, because you have so much data on like, this is what they need. Like, they need this extra help they need. And you might not be heard as a teacher, because teachers are kind of like ignored by the uppers, not all the time, but sometimes their hands are kind of tied. But if a parent comes in and they complain about it, it's like all hands on deck. So I do want parents to know that too, like, advocate for your child because teachers may be advocating. And if your teacher does reach out to you and they're like, hey, I'm seeing X, Y, and Z, I've tried to get them extra help and I am unable to, that is the teacher asking for your help, because parents really do have more of a pull than a teacher ever will.
What you just said is so important. I was actually writing it down because I want to repeat it. Yeah. So important.
So important. So you get to a point where you're like, okay, he's a first grader. You are now figuring out more, I'm assuming, about how children learn to read, and you're starting to implement this. So is what you were implementing a lot to do with your Steps to Reading program that you have? Is that kind of like what you were following?
The Steps to Reading program was created after I taught Eric. The Steps to Reading program didn't exist. So I cobbled things together from different sources. Mm-hmm. And Steps to Reading is based on the science of reading. It goes in a systematic way. It gives you exactly which phonics rule to teach next. It has instructions on each page, so you don't need a teacher's handbook. But it is the curriculum and it tells you what decodable story the child can read at each step and which sight word to also teach. And sight words, we haven't talked much about sight words, but in Steps to Reading, they're basically handled as the most frequently used words that kids will be confronted with that either cannot be sounded out, like the, or that follow phonics rules that they haven't learned yet, but might be appearing in the decodable story, because decodable stories aren't perfect.
Yes, you have to have those high frequency words because they make up so much of text that you just kind of have to learn those. And one thing I would say too is if you are teaching high frequency words via flashcards, you can do that, but I would stop, because you need to continue to use the same thing you would teach a pattern, like a phonetic pattern. Teach it like that with high frequency words, because you need to make sure that you're still, like the has TH, right? So it still has that sound. You can still segment sounds, and then whatever sound is irregular, you can, I used to put a heart around it, something we have to remember by heart, right? So have them spell with it, have them read it, have them, scramble letters and then have them build it or whatever. So like do things that are still going to follow the same, I guess, strategy that you would use to teach a pattern as well. Because I just know, I'm just saying it because I used to be the flashcard teacher. Here's your flashcards and good luck, memorize. And it's not effective. Anyway, sorry, back to high frequency words.
So just to explain a little bit more about Steps to Reading. So it used to be, so when this all began, so how this began, I never planned to be a tutor or to own a tutoring company. This was not in the works. I had, as a clinical psychologist, I had thought that I would counsel women who were experiencing infertility, because one of my earlier books had been on miscarriage and infertility, and I had experienced miscarriage, and I knew what a painful trajectory infertility could be. How this path came to be was I learned because of Eric, and when I was in grad school, how many kids were being labeled learning disabled when there was no problem. I thought, this is really terrible. I have to write an article about this. As a former journalist, right, that was natural for me. Okay, I have to write an article, have to share this news. It's sort of why I wrote the book, to help, like, parents, you must know this. But I didn't have time to write an article, and I gave my local library in Greenwich Village in Manhattan was having a presentation on how children learn to read. And I went to it, and the librarian said, oh, in school your children will be learning phonics. So I raised my hand. Well, at the end, I guess I did raise my hand. I didn't interrupt her, but when she was able to take my question, I said, well, some schools might be teaching phonics, because I didn't want to say, you're wrong.
Yes.
Well, and in New York, rare. Maybe Catholic schools were, but private and public schools, for the most part, were teaching balanced literacy. And I said, most schools were not, may not be teaching phonics, and this is how to recognize if they're not. This is what, in a very non-alarmist way, I said, this is what you can do to help your child, and this is what you might see happen. And I said to the parents, children are not like adults. If we don't understand something, we'll raise our hand and we'll say, I don't understand, explain it to me. Children either move to the back of the room and become totally silent, which is what happened to Eric. My little chatterbox, I came in kindergarten and I saw him sitting in the back of the room sort of hanging his head in shame because he didn't know how to read, and I didn't know what was wrong. But they will either move to the back of the room and become silent and hope that the teacher never calls on them to read because they don't know how to do it, or they will become behavior problems to deflect from whatever they can't do. All of a sudden the attention is on their behavior and not on their academic stuff. And I said, inevitably your school will say to you, something's wrong with your child. And don't necessarily believe that. Just either teach your child yourself or find someone who can teach your child phonics. And a mother came up to me afterwards and said, what you're describing is exactly what's happening to my daughter. Her school isn't teaching her how to read, and now they send home these books with big words. She didn't know what a pattern book was, but she said with these big words that she can't possibly read. And now they're saying they think she has ADHD. And the mother said, well, if she had ADHD, I would want to help her and support her, but I see no signs of ADHD at home. I really don't think that's the problem. Will you teach her how to read? So I taught her how to read the way that I had taught Eric. And I have to say that I'm not one to give myself pats on the back easily, but I really will give myself a pat on the back for this one. I really figured out how to teach him correctly. I really followed the science of reading, and I used, I taught this girl the same way I had taught Eric. And she learned over the summer how to read beautifully, went back to school, and everything was fine. And I felt like I had saved her academic life. And I thought, this is what I did. Yeah. I thought, this is what I want to do with my career and my knowledge. So I then switched to developmental psych, did my dissertation on reading. When I began the tutoring company, it was just me tutoring. I passed out flyers at my local school. People flocked immediately because this was an issue. Parents knew their kids weren't reading, so the business was an immediate success. Excuse me. A group of parents said to me, you know what, you did such a great job with reading, just keep them and do whatever you want. So I developed curriculum for math, grammar, test prep, writing, because this is another issue that we haven't talked about. A lot of skills aren't taught to kids in schools these days. Parents often come to me, why are they not learning grammar? Why are they not learning spelling? My kid doesn't know what a noun is, what a verb is. It's this whole belief, like it's like a progressive way of teaching versus traditional. In a progressive classroom, kids are believed to discover their knowledge, and as they read, they will discover grammar. They do not, believe me, they do not discover grammar.
And it's not just schools either that do that. I actually read a book because as an educator, I have gone down so many different rabbit holes on the education system and just like different routes of education and different philosophies and theories and things like that. And one problem I have with have you ever heard of the unschooling approach?
Sure, yep.
That is one thing that I cannot get behind on certain aspects because I read a book about it because I'm just a weirdo and I read about a bunch of different philosophies and try to figure out for myself like which one is actually effective. And in this, they were talking about that, like what you're saying, like they're just going to, if you expose it to them enough, just via like reading and talking and whatever, they're just eventually going to pick it up. And I'm just like, no, you have to explicitly teach certain things. Like, yes, there are some things that you can kind of just, I guess, learn by doing or learn by watching and modeling and things like that. Yes, there are certain things that you can do that with. But reading and math and writing, those are three things that like you have to explicitly teach it to them. And I actually had a math curriculum one year that they wanted us to follow to fidelity. And it was what you're talking about, where we couldn't start out a lesson by teaching the concept. We had to essentially like make them work through it and see if they could figure it out, which you start to see so much frustration because they're so confused. And I'm like, like I said, there are certain things that as an educator, I was like, I'm not doing this. Like if for a split second, if I saw this isn't working, I don't care if I have to do it to fidelity. I'm breaking the rule and you can get mad at me later, but I'm not going to do it. And obviously I wouldn't like tell my administration that I wasn't teaching to fidelity, but I didn't do it. And I was like, no, I'm going to teach them the concept, because math is a language. You have to, just as you teach reading, you have to teach it as if you were teaching reading, and they have to have certain foundational skills, and you have to explicitly teach them how to do it. So yeah, anyway, sorry, that was just one thing I had to bring up, because unschooling drives me insane with the fact that they think that they're just going to learn it through exposure. So anyways, you were saying that there is like, learn through
discovery. And then the traditional way, right, where the teacher's like a sage on a stage imparting the lesson. And there's a place for both. After you've taught them the lesson, let them discover something.
Exactly.
But yeah.
So that's interesting. But you were saying, sorry, I don't even remember where you were going with that, that they weren't teaching grammar and like nouns, and they were confused, like, why are they not teaching these things?
So I was explaining the trajectory of the tutoring. So we became a K through 12 tutoring company, and I no longer could teach the children myself. So I wrote for my tutors the reading curriculum, because I wanted them to follow what I did. And they used this, some of the sheets were handwritten, and then I realized this is just so remarkably effective, because even, brand new tutors who did not have, letters training or official, years and years of training, they taught the kids how to read beautifully using this book, and parents were using the book, and it's adorable. The illustrations in it are adorable. It has little games that kids can play, bingo games and board games. So it's not just worksheets. It's worksheets. It games. It gives you computer activities that you can do with the child, and really makes it a fun activity. That's what I was saying. For me, teaching Eric to read, like I write in I Didn't Believe Him, was very stressful, because I had to figure it out, and I had to figure it out fast, and there was this pressure of they're thinking something's wrong with him, and I have to teach him quickly so they realize he's okay. Yeah. But if I was given a book like Steps to Reading, which is adorable and fun and kids love, how nice to share that if it interests you. I would never say to any parent, because being a parent is so much work. You have so little time for yourself and for the pleasure, that you want to just spend with your kids. But, if this feels like something that feels right to you, because so many parents want to teach their kid how to read, they think, why not, right? It's really can be such a fun experience, fun for you, fun for them. And that feeling that you have, like when it clicks and all of a sudden they get it, it's just the best feeling in the world.
Yes, and I think it's important too. You kind of talked about this earlier on, that you were talking about, like, you just, you knew that your child needed to play, and so you didn't really, teach them to read or whatever, right? Because you were like, I just wanted to play with them, and they need play. And that is so true. Like, these younger kids do need so much play, because play is how they learn. It really is. Like, that's how they explore their language, and they explore the different roles that maybe they see within their household and all of these things, right? So play is so important. But one thing you can do, like you were talking with the Steps to Reading, right, is you can incorporate play and learning to read so simply, so like whether it's, your child, because the basics are, right, that they need to have phonological awareness, which is going to be like rhyming and tell me the beginning sound in this word. And you can do that through just playing and interacting with your child, right? Like if you're playing with dinosaurs and you're like, ooh, dinosaur, dinosaur, that first sound is d, right? Like, so you can kind of incorporate these things while you're playing with your child. And even with letters, right? Like you can do sensory bins, and you can throw a couple of letters in there and talk about, this is the letter A and it says ah. Can you think of a word that has the ah sound, right? So really just like incorporating it into the play. Maybe you're not like explicitly sitting down with a 4-year-old and being like, we're going to sit here for 15 minutes and teach reading, but you can do it via the play, right? Through a bingo game or whatever it is. So you can still have that play and have that learning.
Or another fun game that I like is you say, I spy with my little eye, something that begins with a B, and then you make the sound, and then you show the letter written, and then they're looking for it, so that there's a fine line. Like, yes, you can incorporate it into play, but sometimes I think this is my opinion. I think play should be play, right? Like if you're playing with dinosaurs, I would play, and yes, maybe a little bit of a sound, but don't turn play into a reading lesson. Like, don't do it, because parents sometimes overdo it, right? Like I always tell parents, when you read with your child at bedtime, just read to them for the joy and pleasure and bonding. Don't turn that time into a reading lesson. Do have a separate time. So like, or if you do the dinosaur thing, maybe have a group of toys that you use just for play, for reading, right? So you do still keep that wonderful, precious one-on-one play, right?
Yes.
But you also have play that is introducing the letters. So like, having figurines or something that you use for that, or stamps. You can use for that, or playing I Spy with my little eye, or another game that I love, you hide a letter somewhere, and how you play hot or colder. You're getting closer, you say you're hotter, or further away you're colder. If they're getting closer to the letter, make the letter sound louder and louder as they get closer and closer. So like right, they're getting close. So they're hearing that sound. They are completely playing with you. They're only playing, right? And then they find the letter, so they see that letter, and they see the C. They have no idea that you're teaching them, right? They're playing, but it's a fun and completely age-appropriate way to introduce it.
Yes, and I do agree. Like, if your child is playing, you don't have to, and I think that's one thing too, like, you think that you like have to engage with them in like making them learn something all of the time, right? But in play, just playing, they're going to learn something. Now, and so I do agree, like you don't have to incorporate this in all of the things, right? Because play is also the only time in a child's life where they really can have like full control and autonomy at that time, because it's their own creation of whatever it is they're creating in their little world of play, right? And so it is important that they are able to do that, because that's the time of autonomy and creation and all of these good things. And so, yes, I do agree. Like, you don't need to incorporate learning in every time you're playing. But yes, I just think it's important that when you are even teaching them to read, I think some parents see teaching to read as like a very like worksheet heavy thing. I think mostly because that's what they saw in school. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like, when you're teaching a kid to read, you can actually incorporate that play part of it, right? To get them, like you said, it doesn't even feel like learning. It's just like you're playing with your child, but then they're also learning something important. So I think it is important to have that balance, just like everything in life, right? You have to have a balance. So I don't want to keep you forever. We've been talking now for like almost an hour and 15 minutes, and I've loved this conversation, and I think it's going to be so helpful for so many parents. But where can they find you with your Steps to Reading, your book, and all of that good stuff?
So Steps to Reading, the name of my website is stepstoreading.com. You can find information on I Didn't Believe Him there. You can find information on the Steps to Reading workbooks. I'm happy to answer questions that parents have. And I Didn't Believe Him is going to be, I'm not sure when this is airing, but it's going to be available on Amazon August 20th. I really, this is a funny thing for me to say because I'm the author of the book. It's going to sound very strange, but I really, really, really recommend that every parent read this book. I've written 3 other books that, and I've never said that about any of my other books, but this is the book. It explains to you exactly how reading is taught. It reads like a novel. People say, oh, it's a beach read. It's life is hard. There's so much stress. There's so much struggle. When you read I Didn't Believe Him, it's a joy to read because you have yes, it's on a disturbing topic, but you have, there's humor in it. People have said, oh, I love your tone, I love your voice, I can really see your family. We all love to know how other people live. The book takes you behind the scenes of a really well-respected school and shows you exactly what went wrong in that classroom. You're in the classroom a lot of times seeing it. You're with my family as, we're trying to have dinner and talk, and I'm doing like what I said parents shouldn't do. I'm playing a reading game in the restaurant with my child, and we were all so miserable. You can see me making mistakes, and then you can see us triumphing in the end. It's really it's a pleasure to read. It will illustrate the issue for you, and it will educate you in the issue in a way that by the time you finish reading the book, it's sort of like learning through play. In reading an enjoyable book, by the time you get to the end, you will fully understand how children need to be taught to read and how you can help your child do it.
That's so amazing. And I also, I haven't read it, and I honestly would love to read it. But I also think, too, that it really is just such an important issue as well, because people, I don't think, realize how big of a problem it is right now in our nation for, how many people actually can't read. Like, I just looked at the stat. It was like 53% of U.S. adults can't read above a 6th grade level, like right now. And so it's something that's just been going on forever. And so it's so important just to educate yourself as a parent so that you're more informed, so that you can actually have something, like if your teacher is not teaching in an effective way, you now have enough information that you can go to your teacher and be educated about it. And then they can, maybe start to think like, oh, well, like what is she talking about? And what is this book you're talking, So I think that that's also important too, because I think too in education, there seems to be a little bit more of a disconnect. And I don't know if it's always been this way, but I do feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect between school and parent. And you are a team. You need to work together, and the parent knows the child so well. I mean, yes, we as educators are with them for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, but that parent truly does know their child the best. And so if we can, as educators and parents, come together, work together, and both be somewhat knowledgeable on these topics, I think it's going to help a lot of kids.
Yep, absolutely.
So, all right, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I will I'll link your website down below, and if you have any other links that you would like to send me, please do.
All right.
Thank you so much for redoing this. It was so good to talk to you again.
You too.
Okay.
All right, take care. Bye.